The Treaty of Waitangi is one of the most important documents in the history of New Zealand. As an important player in the Pacific and in human rights, it is crucial for our future leaders to know its history so that we can help to negotiate and understand the situation that New Zealand is in, so as the world can be a better place. I thank you for watching, and please enjoy my documentary on the Treaty of Waitangi. New Zealand is one of the most unique places on Earth. For its size, it is very isolated, being more than 4,000 kilometers from the nearest landmass, that of which is Australia. It is no surprise, then, that New Zealand was the last large habitable body of land to be uninhabited by humans, the first of which between roughly 1200 and 1300 AD. The people who arrived were descendants of the Polynesian seafaring peoples that at the time were also discovering other islands of the Pacific, like Hawaii or Easter Island. Eventually, these people developed a distinct culture of their own, and today they are known as the Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand. The first European to discover New Zealand and name it was a Dutchman who went by the name Tasman Abel Janzoen in 1642. He named it after the province of Zeeland in the Netherlands, but it would be almost 100 years later until another European came across New Zealand. The next European to sight New Zealand was the famous explorer Captain James Cook in 1769, who'd also discovered many other areas in the Pacific like Australia, Hawaii, and Tahiti, to name a few. He recommended it for colonization to the British Parliament, but it wasn't until the late 1820s did the first British settlers start arriving in New Zealand. These first settlers were primarily missionaries who wished to convert the indigenous Maori to Christianity, but they found the way for more mostly non-religious motivated settlers to arrive in New Zealand. Around 1830, more settlers started arriving in New Zealand, but there was no central government to law over them. By the late 1930s, the situation had degraded so much that the British Parliament was forced to find some way to intervene. That wasn't the only reason Britain wanted to get sovereignty over New Zealand, though. Their biggest rivals at the time, the French Empire, also had plans to colonize and gain control of New Zealand. So in 1940, the British Parliament told Captain William Hobson to formalize a treaty with the many Maori tribes so that he could enforce British law in New Zealand. Hobson, a former officer for the British Navy, was then sent to New Zealand and formed the document now known as the Treaty of Waitangi. The treaty would grant to all the Maori who signed it British citizenship and all those rights that came with British citizenship. Hobson also promised the many tribes that signed it that he would form a land commission committee to investigate all possibly unfair land purchases between the Maori and the settlers. On February 6, 1840, at Waitangi, also known as the Bay of Islands, which is where the treaty got its name, Hobson got nearly 40 tribal chieftains to sign the treaty. Until September, though, Hobson still went around the North Island of New Zealand, getting signatures from the many tribes and chieftains of the area. These signatures were necessary, as the Maori at the time numbered around 125,000 strong, while the settlers were only 2,000 strong. On September 3, 1840, the last signature was gained for the Treaty of Waitangi. In all, nearly 400 tribal chieftains signed the treaty, giving the British nearly full control of the North Island, and later the South Island as well. Afterwards, Hobson was appointed the Royal Governor of New Zealand. Many of the settlers at the time were unhappy with Hobson, though, as they felt he was too binded to the treaty, which the settlers felt was too pro-Maori in nature and wasn't made in the settlers' interest. Another unpopular choice Hobson also made was to move the capital to Waitemata instead of the city that they felt would be the better choice, Port Nicholson. Because of this, Hobson felt that the settlers were unloyal to the crown and fought them with all his political might. Eventually, though, finding the settlers became too much, and in September 1842, Captain William Hobson, Royal Governor of New Zealand, died of a stroke in office. His successor would be the pioneering meteorologist and naval commander, Captain Robert Fitzroy. The settlers still felt that nothing had changed with Fitzroy in office, though. That, and also the fact that the New Zealand government he was appointed to was bankrupt, did not help his situation. To add to all this, the Maori were beginning to realize the European concept of land ownership was more solid than they realized, and the Maori and the settlers' opinions of each other were at a down point. This deterioration of opinions between the Maori and the settlers led to the Flagstaff War, otherwise known as Honeka's Rebellion or as the First New Zealand War, in which nearly 200 people died. There would be more wars with the Maori for the rest of the century over land rights between the Maori and the Bekeha, also known as the Europeans. At this point, the British government finally realized that they couldn't neglect the needs of their new colony and replaced Fitzroy with George Grey, an army officer and an experienced politician. The British government also gave many subsidies to the New Zealand colonial government, and the colonial government's finances finally got under control. With the newfound money, the New Zealand government could afford to buy large amounts of land from the Maori, and the settlers' thirst for land was quenched. Gold was also discovered on the South Island, and a gold rush soon occurred that would lead to more settlers moving to New Zealand. All the settlers that moved to New Zealand hoping to get rich fast demanded land faster than they could buy it, and eventually the New Zealand government started to force the Maori to sell their land for very low prices, which would eventually lead to more wars with the many different tribes until nearly 1880. Even with all the controversy and even warring that went on at the time because of the Treaty of Waitangi is widely considered to this day the founding document of New Zealand. Today, New Zealand is well renowned for its high standard of living and its high importance as a U.S. ally in the Pacific. It is very useful to know how it and its people, and even how other countries and other people from those countries respond to different situations, by looking at history and how that might affect the world today. And I thank you for watching my documentary about the Treaty of Waitangi and its effects on New Zealand and the world.